2021, police in Devon were searching for the head of a decapitated body in the hope of identifying the victim and unlocking the investigation. At this stage, all detectives knew was that the victim was in her 60s and she was of Asian origin. So a huge search was underway by Devon and Cornwall police in the surrounding woodland.
They need to find the head, basically. It must have been quite a challenge for them.
Identifying her would have been critically important in finding out what has happened and how she ended up there. So they've got a really big job on their hands. They obviously searched for several days.
The window to find new leads from the wider public was also closing.
As the holiday season progresses, people go back to their normal homes and it could become quite a disparate investigation then. That kind of transient population in terms of holidaymakers coming and going would be quite critical to start conducting house-to-house inquiries and local inquiries to ensure that you captured people who were there at the time. The fact that it was holiday season would place added pressure and priority in getting resources out in order to conduct those inquiries whilst people were still local.
Suddenly, police made a breakthrough.
4 days into the search, approximately 30 feet away from the original find, police search officers recovered the head of the body. This is a really significant find for the investigation. Firstly, it kind of completes the puzzle in terms of, is this the only scene? Attention can now be drawn to identifying who that victim was.
But unlike the body that had been discovered a few days before, the head was very, very badly decomposed. It was effectively a skull.
The first thing to determine is whether the head and the body have a physical fit. And in this case they did, showing that they'd come from the same person. The head was said to be defleshed, a bit like this. But when human remains are left out in the open, insects and animals begin to destroy the soft tissues very quickly, making identification much more difficult. But if animals were responsible, it's unlikely this skull would have been so cleanly defleshed. And the headband the woman wore wasn't disturbed, suggesting the flesh had been stripped by a human.
The way in which it had been defleshed up to the headband, that's a deliberate act, obviously.
Seeing a body in this situation, there's probably a strong motive. Whoever did this had a strong motive to do so. It's unlikely to be a random attack, a chance meeting, that kind of incident or that kind of offence.
And then the police would know they are looking for a very sadistical killer. Very dangerous person, obviously.
Detectives knew they had a murder investigation on their hands. DNA samples from the now complete body were compared to police missing persons records to identify their victim. DNA tests confirmed this was a 67-year-old woman, Mi Quen Chong, also known as Deborah Chong.
Deborah Chong was born in Malaysia but had lived in the UK for many years. She was a retired lady.
Deborah had been reported missing from home by a lodger from a home in Wembley in London.
One of her lodgers had become concerned that he hadn't seen her. He did expect her to be at the house when he came back from work, and the fact that she wasn't there was not just out of character, it was extremely concerning for him.
The lodger was, of course, immediately worried at what had happened to Deborah, and particularly when he saw her glasses on the side, which he needed, and her mobile phone, which she always took with her.
I know that he contacted people that were Deborah's friends, including someone that told that Deborah had gone to the seaside and she was feeling quite depressed. So hearing that Deborah, his landlady, but also his friends, had sort of taken herself off, which was extremely strange. Not only was it out of character for Deborah to go anywhere sort of beyond a street away from her house, it would be strange for anyone who wore glasses and had a mobile phone to leave the house to, you know, nip down to Tesco's, let alone to go on a trip to the seaside without those two important items with them.
So the Metropolitan Police would have primacy for the investigation of her as a missing person. Clearly the body had been found in Devon, and a real focus would be how does Deborah go from being missing in London to being recovered in a decomposed and headless state in Devon, an area that she seemingly would have had no need or reason to visit.
By now, Deborah's body was beginning to help police form a picture of what happened to her. But the cause of death was still inconclusive. A closer look at her torso revealed multiple broken ribs. But there's no evidence of bruising that would suggest these were caused by a weapon or a sustained attack. We know Deborah lived in the southeast, but her headless body was found in Devon. It's possible, if she was killed in London, that her body sustained these injuries whilst it was being moved by the killer. Detectives needed to know more about Deborah and the life she lived.
They need to find out all about her life. That's how you find a killer. So they've got to look where she's from, what her circumstances are.
Deborah Chong first came to Britain as a student. She was on a student visa and she went to study at Huddersfield Technical College. And it was while she was studying there that she met her husband, and they settled down together. And, you know, by all accounts had a very happy and loving marriage. But unfortunately, he died a few years before Deborah, and she was hit very hard by the grief of losing him, and it affected her health.
And then in 2021, her sister died. This had believed to have triggered a decline in her mental health.
Deborah was vulnerable. Deborah had schizophrenia and she was on medication for that.
Perhaps because of the problems and the suffering that she'd gone through, she was very kind-hearted towards others and wanted to help people, especially people who were struggling for one reason or another. And if she could help them, either financially or in terms of support, then she certainly did. And there's several examples of how she took people in, gave them a roof over their heads, didn't ask for rent, and really made it her mission to look after others.
Deborah was a devout Christian and was known to be very generous, generous with her money, supporting homeless charities, homeless people. And that vulnerability is something that perhaps got preyed upon at times.
As detectives dug deeper into Deborah's past, one name kept coming up. 36-year-old osteopath Gemma Mitchell, who Deborah befriended at her church.
Deborah befriends different people at the church, but particularly Gemma. Gemma's a lot younger, you know, she could be her daughter in age. Also really a devout Christian, and they seem quite close for a good while.
Gemma Mitchell came to the attention of investigators as someone who had been in regular and recent contact with Deborah. And they had started to spend increasing amounts of time together.
We know quite a bit about Mitchell. She studied osteopathy and then she set up her own practice. After many years away in Australia, she moved in to the family home with her mother. It was a huge family house and it had been in the family for many generations, but over time it had become rather dilapidated and it was in dire need of renovation. It needed hundreds of thousands of pounds spending on it just to sort of make it habitable again. This sorry state of affairs dated back to 2016. when Mitchell's mother instructed a firm of builders to do the work and paid them her entire life savings.
The first builders she paid £135,000 to, but that builder then went bust.
So Gemma Mitchell took over managing the project, and Mitchell found another firm of builders, and she gave them £100,000 and had promised more, but the money never materialised.
As a result, the second builder left the site, and this left the house in a state of disrepair with the no roof and a tarpaulin cover.
Having this project sort of half done had put Mitchell in a terrible situation, and I think she felt responsible as well, having promised her mother that she could do this project and could be trusted with it, and everything was just going horribly wrong. And by this point, I think she was getting really quite desperate.
And she knows that Deborah has money, and so she asks her if she'll loan her some. And Deborah, being a very kind lady, agrees to that.
Deborah agreed to give Gemma a massive £200,000 loan.
Deborah initially offered to support her on the condition that the house would be used for Christian worship.
Because Mitchell was so desperate, you know, she accepted all the terms and was just keen to get moving and prove to her mother that she could actually do this.
But Deborah Chong soon had a change of heart.
Something rang alarm bells, and she thought, this is just going to be a bottomless pit, this house. So Deborah perhaps thought best to cut her losses, tell her friend Gemma the truth, that she wouldn't be able to give her that money. She wasn't willing to do that. Gemma probably felt let down, and that could have built up a lot of resentment. Things seemed to go from bad to worse. She was extremely angry.